Hi, this is the MC707 Groovebox from Roland. And they're coming back into the game quite strong with a clip launcher style workflow, powerful synth engine, and time-stretching looper. Let's start with an overview of the hardware. You've got 16 velocity-sensitive RGB pads for playing drum kits, synths, and more, and 16 additional buttons for step sequencing. The MC707 has an 8-track architecture. Each track can either be a synth track, meaning it can play notes, or chords, a drum track, right, with 16 different samples on it, and a looper, meaning that it can play in time stretch audio loops as well as record loops in real time, either from internal audio or external audio coming in through the inputs. Each of the 8 tracks can have up to 16 different clips or phrases, and you can move freely between them and have any of the 8 tracks play any of its 16 clips at any time. You've got individual level control on a per track basis, and each track also has 3 knobs which you can assign to a number of different parameters using the knob assign button, and each track can have different parameters assigned to any one of the 3 knobs. These 3 parameters can then be motion sequenced across your clip. On the right are 5 pad mode buttons which control what the pads do. You've got an LCD screen with 4 endless encoders that control various parameters based on which screen you're on, as well as arrow keys and a value knob for changing parameters. If you have more than 4 parameters available, let's say if I hit this, then the function key will blink, and then you can move back and forth between pages of additional parameters. Most of the buttons have shift functions labeled underneath the buttons. You access them obviously by hitting shift and the button. All right, let's talk about connectivity. It's fairly comprehensive. You've got 2 5-pin MIDI outs for sequencing external gear and 1 5-pin MIDI in. USB will let you send and receive MIDI, but also audio for each of the individual tracks in stereo, as well as access the SD card over USB, which is always nice and kind of rare these days. You've got either mic or line modes for mono or stereo sampling. Mono or stereo sends and returns, we'll talk about that later. Assignable outputs, you can send any one of the tracks out these outputs if you want for analog processing, and then both mono or stereo mix out in phones, and you've got level control for each of those independently. Let's take a quick look at the screen layout. Like I mentioned, you've got 8 tracks. Each track can be either a tone, drum, or looper track, so T, D, or L up here on top. As I mentioned, each track has up to 16 clips. You can only see 8 clips at a time, 8 rows of clips. So as you scroll down, more clip rows are revealed. And there's this little map here on the left that shows you where you are overall. Let's start this beat going. You can't hear anything because I didn't set any of the clips to launch, right? But I can go around and select, let's say this one to launch. It will start on the next clock interval here. Then maybe let's select this one, right? And then this one. So you can launch the clips individually, but you can also launch scenes, which are sets of clips. There are 8 scenes. You access the first 4 by hitting these buttons, right? Call scene 2. And then if I wanted to call scene 6, 7, or 8, or 5, I would just hit shift and press this, right? A bit more about the screen, you've got various clip options here or track options if you go all the way to the top, and there are level meters here on the bottom. So these 8 lines will show you where you're at in terms of levels. Yeah, this grid layout is very similar to Ableton Live. The only difference is that scenes in Ableton Live launch a particular row, whereas scenes here can be any clip you select per track from wherever you want across the range of 16 clips. Okay, so let's take a deeper look at the different types of tracks, tone, drum, and looper. For that, I'll start up a new project. You can move around, by the way, with the arrows, and then either hit enter or press this encoder. You can move around with this as well. Right, start new project. Don't save. Okay. You select the track that you want to edit by hitting the select button for the individual track, and by default you get a drum track, right? And then The second track is a simple tone track or synth track. You can see they're denominated here as well. 1 is D, 2 is T, and then if I wanted to add or create another track, I just go in here and I could create a different track. There's a variant on drum tracks, which is a drum track with a compressor. We'll ignore that for this tutorial, and I could create a looper track just by doing this. So let's first take a look at the drum and tone tracks. While you can create your own kits and your own synth sounds, and we'll talk about how you do that, there are a ton of both drum kit presets and synth sound presets or tone presets on board. So if I wanted to change the sound, I would just hit the sound button. And there's a really nice feature here. While you can scroll through the bank of presets, you can also load presets from a particular project you already saved. But let's take a look at the presets, and these are drum preset kits. There are literally a ton to choose from. You've got 2 banks here, and you could sort this by number or by name, or just go through them, and they'll preview a kit for you. Right. So as we scroll through these, you get a nice preview of all the sounds. So let's say pick something more traditional, right? Just hit enter. And now this has become our drum kit. Same goes for tones. So if we go into the tone track, hit sound, I can load presets, load from projects, and here I can also import samples from my SD card. Let's take a look at the presets. Same deal here. You've got category and then banks or filtering, then the individual tones, and yeah, there are hundreds of tones here per bank. Yeah, and I could go on. Let's just sort, say, by category. Choose maybe a synth bass sound. Okay, let's go with this. Then finally, for looper tracks, again, press sound. You can either load loops from projects, so loops that you already recorded previously, or take a loop at the SD card. And yeah, I've got a few samples here, so I could loop any loop I wanted. Let's say this guy, import. All right, so that's that loop, and I'll show you how to sample loops as well later on. Okay, let's take a deeper look into the sound design engines for both the synth or tone tracks and the drum tracks. If you're not interested in that and only want to play the presets, feel free to skip ahead to sequencing later on. Let's start with a tone or synth engine. I'll create a track here, make it a tone track. To access the synth in the tone track, you hit Shift and Sound, and you have access to this screen. Now, I know this is a little bit scary in the beginning, but this is actually the only screen or the main screen you have to deal with in sound design. There are 2 modes which you can use this synth engine, either easy or partial. It starts out in partial mode. Why don't we just start out with easy for beginners, and I'll talk about partials later. These are the overall modules for the synth. You've got overall control, octave transposition, voice polyphony, and so on. Then you've got 4 oscillators, right? A filter, amp control, EQ, and then insert effects. You may have noticed that as I moved back and forth across these modules, you have various parameters here which you can control with these encoders, and if the function light is blinking, it means that there's another page of parameters. So these are the modules of the signal chain. On top, you've got the modulators. Let's ignore structure for a second. You've got pitch envelope and LFO, which can be routed to cutoff and pitch, and another one for amp and panning, each with their shapes, of course. Then a filter envelope, 2 mod matrix slots, and a mixer module with level, pan, delay, and reverb sends. So let's run through the synth engine real quickly. On the oscillator side, you've got different engine types, right? This one is virtual analog, and then different waveforms. So virtual analog is pretty simple. You've got saw, square, triangle, right? Few options there. You've got pulse width control for every shape and PWM built right in. Okay. Alongside virtual analog, the second main kind of oscillator or engine is PCM. This is a sample-based engine, and the idea behind PCM is that a sample has a certain transient that it starts with, and then another section that it loops around. So you've got a few analog style waveforms here, but you know, they vary very quickly and go well out of synth style, right, as you scroll through these.
One.
So substantially more timbral diversity, obviously within the limits of the framework of PCM. So this isn't a sample library where every single pitch and various levels are sampled individually. Aside from using samples in the internal database, you can also load up your own samples. Right now, I don't have any sample loaded in this project, but I could go into project, select sample, and then check out my SD card again. Right. Let's just, this is nice. Let's import this. And then if I go back into my sound, go into sample, I now have this waveform loaded up. I can play it and also chop it up if I like, create loop points and so on. There are a few other oscillator types. There's PCM sync with noise and a bunch of other waveforms. Supersaw, right, with detune, and then just noise if I want that. So that's just one oscillator. There are 4 of these, right? So I could layer up additional sounds on top of the one that I have here. Let's say I want to add, you know, an additional sound. Right, so now I have these 2 layers, and I could keep on adding additional layers. Next up is the filter. That's pretty straightforward, I guess. Right? There's cutoff control. If you press a knob in, by the way, that's coarse movement, and if you just move it like that, it's fine-tune motions, which takes a while to sweep the filter. Right, there's resonance, of course. And that's right, that's just one type of filter. There are plenty of others. We won't go through all of these, right? Next up is amp envelope control, right, for attack, decay, sustain, and release, an EQ module, and finally an insert effects. So let's just pick any one of these. I mean, there's so many of these. If I just scroll through these quickly, it'll take a while to demo all of these, so I won't, but just scrolling through them very briefly, you can see how deep the effects section here goes. So if that's easy mode, what's the more difficult partials mode? The idea here is that each and every one of the oscillators can be treated independently with separate LFOs, pitch envelope, filter envelope, and amp envelopes, which is a really powerful sound design tool if you care to deal with it. There's also an additional screen available to see what's going on a per oscillator basis or per partial basis. If you hit enter, you can see the individual parameters for each of the different partial elements. So that's a whole video on its own. I won't dive deeper into that. Let's take a look at drum tracks. So here too, if you don't want to load presets and you want to design your own sounds, you simply hit Shift and Sound to edit each of the pads. Now the rabbit hole here goes quite deep as well. I won't dive into all of it, but let's say, for example, I want to edit this pad, the kick, right? So I could enter this. I could select a different instrument if I wanted, a different preset or a wave file. But if I go to Instrument Edit, you can see the layers of complexity in here, right? So each pad can trigger not just 1, but 4 different samples with all of these individual parameters on a per sample basis, and this supports both one-shot samples as well as PCM sounds. There's filter control, pitch envelopes, filter envelopes, right? So if you choose to go down this rabbit hole, there is a lot to explore inside here. Okay, before we get to looper tracks, let's talk about sequencing both tone and drum tracks. Right, so I'll go back into my bird's eye view. Sequencing drums and tones is really simple. You can either step sequence them or record them live. If you want to record them live, you just hit record, and depending on your finger drumming skills, which I do not have, you could play them live. Step sequencing is easy as well. If it's a simple 16-step pattern, you just choose the drum or pad you want to sequence and just drop it wherever you want. Right? Still have my looper going here in the background. Let's lower that. Right, so easy to sequence that and choose whatever I want, right? And lay down additional pads. And, rinse and repeat for every pad. Sequencing notes is also pretty simple, but works the other way around. So whereas with pads, you select the pad and then choose the step, in a tone track, you first select the step you want to sequence and then, right, dial in the notes. So I put this in step 1. Let's just put this in step 9. Now those tabs are pretty short. I could make them longer either using these controls here. I just go note by note, or maybe it would be easier just to erase this and hit record, just play the pattern in. Now here too, if you want to get a little bit more advanced, right? So let's say if I wanted to take these hi-hats and add ratchets to them, you just hit shift and the step you want to add the ratchets to. These are sub-steps here. You could add ratchets or flams. You could also add mute probability if you wanted. Right, for some rhythmic variation. And notes and beats don't need to be aligned to a grid. You could set a start point that's an offset from any of the grid points, even more so in the tone tracks. If I take one of my steps, let's say this guy, you can, on a per note basis, not only edit velocity and its length, but also separate start points per note if you were so inclined, right? This won't be noticeable, I think, with a pad, but it does work quite nicely. And by the way, while we're on this page, you're not limited to 1 octave and not even 4 notes. So let's just go up an octave, maybe add this here and then this, right? So I'm not sure exactly what the limit here is here on number of notes. We could stress test this. Yeah, so we've got now 7 notes in this particular step. Now, where I think things get really interesting is that each clip can have obviously not just 16 steps, up to 128 steps, but also its own scaling. So if you hit shift and measure, I could change the number of steps, let's say in this drum track, right, to polymetric pattern lengths, which doesn't sound too good with this pattern, but works with, say, melodies. And then I could change the relative scale of this pattern to make it either faster, right? The chords are changing at the same rate, but now the beat is playing either much slower or faster. Right? Triplets. Really nice stuff here. You can also change the play direction, forward, backwards, forwards and backwards, and random if you liked. Just get this maybe to normal, right? And there's also shuffle or swing. It's really nice clip-based controls here. A little bonus sequencing mode, by the way, if I maybe go into a new track, make it a tone track, and then just select any tone here. Let's maybe go for a bell or piano. Anyway, if you hit record plus step, then you can just play notes in, right? And if I lower my other tracks, right, I get this. And why not add some reverb send to it? You do that, by the way, by holding the track and turning this knob. You also have send to the delay, panning control, and mix level if you hold the select button and turn the endless encoders. All right, so we covered tone tracks, drum tracks. We played a looping sample on a looper track. Let's see how you live loop into this. So I'll go back into my looper track, choose an empty clip. Now before you record a loop, you want to set your looper settings. You've got input control for the external input, which you need to increase anyway, but Shift and Edit gets you to the input control and looping control menu. You can choose to record in stereo or mono. I'll go for mono. You can resample any of the internal tracks or the whole mix or audio coming from your PC, but I'm going to go for external audio, and you can set anywhere between 1 to 8 measures. Let's go for 1 measure. So I've got my handy microphone here. Yeah, and if I'm ready to record, just hit play, and I hit record. It'll wait for the next cycle. And then once you see the indicator in the clip, that's my cue. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's art right there. Now there's no overdubbing, but I could choose another slot and record into that. So 1, 2. Right, this is my current song. 2. Let's go into here. 1, 2. Hit record. 3, 4. 3, 4. 3, 4. Right, and now in true Ableton style, I could go ahead and select this clip. 4. 1, 2. 1, 2. 3, 4. So certainly a capable platform for live looping. You could also set up multiple looper tracks, right, and record layers upon layers, not by overdubbing, but just by recording to separate tracks, then apply different insert effects, bring layers in and out, and get pretty creative with that. Another cool thing about this 3, 4. Is that 3, 4. These loops are time stretched, 1, 2. Right? So if I change the tempo 1, of my project, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, it'll slow down 2, or speed 1, up 2, without changing pitch, 1, by the way. 2, 1, 2, 1. If I wanted to change pitch, 1, I could do 2, that to myself. 1, 2. If you promise not to 1, laugh, right? 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Now, if you noticed, the time stretch on that sounded a little bit choppy, and that's because I was in pitch stretch algorithm type 2, which is better for rhythmic samples. Since this is, I guess, more melodic to the extent you could say that about my voice, type 1 works better for that. So yeah, I think this algorithm works better for 1, 2 vocal samples. 1, 2. Obviously it breaks down if you go real low. 1, 2. 1, 2. Right? 1. There are some other settings here while we're on the topic. 1, 2. 1. Right, stretch 2. Window is pretty cool. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Especially at the extremes. 1, 2. 1, 2. So, nice vocal effects. 1, if you're 2. Up for that. Oh, and how could I 1, not 2. Turn on reverse, right? Whoosh. No. Whoosh. No. Whoosh. Nope. Just to complete this little bit of monkeying around, you can also trim and chop samples if you want. Right. 1, so 2. If I wanted just 2. 2. This is time stretched, of course. 2. But you could do that as well. 2. And of course, I could bring back the other tracks. 2. This, by the way, is my lovely ambient piece 2, soon available on Bandcamp. 2. Okay, back to serious business. I want to talk a bit about automation. Let's just lower these guys. Stay with this. All right, so you've got parameters here. Remember I said that they can be mapped to anything you want, right? I've got this here, oops. Map to filter. Right, so what if I wanted to automate this motion, well, just hitting motion record will do that. And I could do that for any one of the 24 knobs. If I wanted to change what these knobs control, right, I go into here in knob assign and just go through these very briefly. There are quite a few parameters that you can mess with here. I wish there were more, by the way. I wish you could just motion sequence any parameter you see on any screen, but that's what you have for now right here. Let's put this, say, on octave shift, right? The second one. Right, so if I wanted to, you could also punch in automations just by holding record. If I'm not pleased with an automation, I can just erase it like this. Okay, let's shake things up a bit and talk about the different pad modes. You've got mutes, which are either immediate mutes, right, or start stops for clips, which will take effect on the next cycle. Right. Clip pads, as you scroll through, right, you can activate any clip you want. So this is sort of like, instead of scrolling through this over here and pressing enter, let's say that I wanted to launch this clip over here, right? Then move it to this one and launch this one, right? So really nice way to control and launch clips through here. You could also mute individual drums if you wanted. You could do this either per clip or per track. You have a chord mode if you like, where each pad represents a chord, and you can customize these chords as well if you like, right? So go per pad and change the chord to whatever you like. And then scatter is all these rhythmic effects that, right, you can apply. And these are customizable as well, right? So if you hit Shift Scatter, you can go ahead and edit the parameters for each scatter effect. There are 2 pages of these parameters, right? So you can mess with these for quite a bit. You could actually step sequence scatter if you liked. I'll leave that to your imagination. Let's just round out the discussion and talk about the effects. I've got a basic piano sample here. You've got reverb, delay, and 3 multi-effects, which you can either turn on or off. These are master effects, so you won't hear them unless you apply send from that track to the effect track, and you edit the effect by holding shift and the effect name, right? So shift reverb, and the amount of effects here is truly overwhelming. Of course, for reverb, we want this, right? So those are some of the reverbs. There's delay as well, quite a few of those. Remember, you need to send a track for the master effect to be heard. And there are quite a few options here. On the multi-side, I don't think there's a send for these. They just work. Right? You can turn the mono off if you like. And the number here is also quite overwhelming. Again, this can go on and on. As you can see, there are dozens here, right? And that's just the MFX part. There's also compressor and EQ. Let's talk about a few other miscellaneous features. Send and return, right? If we go to Shift Input and move into the Send and Return section, let you take audio from multiple positions in your signal chain, right? send it out to something external, which could be whatever you want, and then feed it back into the signal chain to, again, multiple locations within the signal chain. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about before we get to the pros and cons is sequencing. Each of the tracks can send out MIDI data either over USB or any one of the two MIDI outputs, right? So if I head up to the top row, right, see the whole track is highlighted, then I go into settings, I can go into MIDI settings and I can turn on or off MIDI out 1, MIDI out 2, and over USB. So you can use this as a sequencer. However, if you don't want to hear the internal engine, you'll have to lower the level of the tracks that you're using to sequence external gear, and you're using up those tracks. You can't hear them in your mix. I'm not sure how that impacts voice count. Maybe if you turn the oscillators off, it doesn't. Hopefully Roland will share some information about that, but generally there aren't independent MIDI clips in here, so you'll need to use up one of the 8 tracks or a few of the 8 tracks if you want to sequence external gear. Okay, let's take a look at the pros and cons. On the cons side, a few things come to mind. First thing, there's no song mode if that's important to you. You do have scenes, right, and you can move between them manually, but there's no way to sequence that in an arranger or something like that. Now, I asked Roland about this and they said it's one of the top feature requests they've heard, so that's not a commitment, but obviously it's on their radar. Other cons, or at least things that I'd like to see, is more than 3 automation lanes, and like I mentioned before, an easy way to just look at a parameter and automate that. There's no arpeggiator if that's important to you. I know it is to me. That said, with flexible clip lengths and 16 clips per track, you could program short sequences, short patterns of 2, 3, 4, 5 notes, and get away with something pretty close. We already talked about sequencing external gear. Hopefully there's a way around that taking up tracks. There's also no way to sequence CC messages. Potentially you could use these to send out CC messages. Maybe that's a feature they can add in the future as well. So perhaps recording motion will also send that as a CC you can determine. We're getting into feature request territory here, but in note mode for synth tracks, I would love to see a scale mode, right? So right now you have access to 1 octave here. It would be nice to see an optional scale mode in notepad mode so that you could play 2 octaves here instead of just 1. Finally, while these knobs are very performance oriented, if you want to edit additional parameters live, let's say I go into the sound and want to change the filter cutoff, right? These knobs aren't very performance oriented. There's fine tune, which is good but takes a lot of turns here, or you can press and turn, but that may be a little bit skippy in terms of the audio. So ideally, maybe they could implement some sort of performance mode where every parameter change just flows with long sweeps that aren't steppy, but give you practical performance control. Finally, in terms of project limits, there are about 6 to 8 minutes of samples that this supports at any one given time for a project, and an individual sample can be up to 60 seconds. There's a total voice polyphony of 64 voices, which is pretty nice. The manual does state that if you use a VCF, an analog emulation, instead of TVF, the default filter, that may impact polyphony, but it seems like there's a lot to work with. On the pros side, I have to say the MC707 is a hell of a version 1.0 of a groovebox. It's a great tool both for creating your own musical ideas and then later on performing them. This Ableton Live style grid, along with 64 voices, sampling, and live looping, is quite a bit of power to pack in one machine, and I think they balanced this power versus ease of use and complexity very nicely. Most things are super intuitive, you can dive in if you want, but you can get a lot done without any menu driving. There actually aren't that many hidden functions. I can think of the select and sends, but pretty much everything else is either labeled in a menu that you can find or labeled as a shift function under the keys. I love the fact that you can borrow kits and presets from other projects. The looper, as I mentioned, is a lot of fun and very usable despite the fact that it doesn't have overdubbing, and the scaled pattern features are also, I think, quite powerful. So that's pretty much it. If you're ready to tackle the tone power of the synth generator in here, you might want to check out my book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comment section below. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to hit the notification bell after you subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.